YouTube. Today, finally, we're going to work on the Camaro. But before we do that, if you haven't seen the video on the shop, check that out. It's in the description. There's a build video and a update of everything that's in the shop. And for you guys that actually watch that, I got a surprise for you. Driveway's done. 2,300 square feet of concrete. So now that the driveway's done, my wallet can finally decompress a little bit. It's good. So today on the Camaro, we have a plan. The whiteboard of organization. Basically, what we're gonna do, after driving the Camaro a little bit and vetting everything out, I noticed I started getting some oil leaks. And it turns out that I have the same problem that most 5th gen owners have with the oil cooler. So basically what this oil cooler does is run engine coolant through this little cooler on the side of the motor, and it also runs your oil through it. So not only is oil leaking out of this thing, but so is coolant. So the plan is, there are these coolant lines. One runs from the radiator, and if we can see it, one runs from the block about there. What we're going to do is we're going to pinch those so that coolant loss is at a minimum. So what we're going to do is drain the oil. We had to do that anyways because we're on some cheap oil just to run through the motor, along with some seafoam to clean everything out. And once the oil is drained, we're going to pinch those lines so that we don't lose too much coolant, drop the oil cooler, and change all the gaskets. While that's still draining, what I'm going to try to do is use these hose crimps and, like I said before, grab the 2 coolant feed lines that are coming from the block and the radiator that go into this cooler. That way when the cooler comes off, obviously we're going to lose a little oil and coolant, but we're not going to have it all rush out of the block. So let's try to get those on. Alright, this was impossible to do holding the camera at the same time, so that's the first one. That's the one that goes up to the radiator. And then this one over here, which comes from the block and goes to the oil cooler. I don't know if you can see that very good on camera. So again, this is to try to prevent all the coolant in the engine from coming out when we don't really need it to. So I'm going to wait for this to drain a little more, and then we're going to start unbolting the oil cooler. So GM recommends that you pull these 2 lines and then dump coolant all over the place and then take the entire cooler off. I don't think we're going to do that. What we're going to do is leave these hard lines on. We're going to take the front of the cooler off that actually holds the rubber gaskets that are leaking, that are allowing coolant and oil to come through. And then once we replace those, we're going to take the back bolts off that hold this to the oil pan and then change that gasket right there. There's no reason to go ahead and take those hard lines off unless you're actually replacing this whole assembly, which I don't think you would ever have to do. Basically, again, this is going to stay on the block. We're going to replace those 4 O-rings. 2 are for coolant, 2 are for oil feed. And then the gasket that goes between the oil pan and the actual oil cooler. All these oil cooler bolts are 13s.
Cut me
don't think blocking that off worked. Seems like an awful lot of coolant coming out.
A few moments later.
I don't think enough pressure was on this line from this little guy. I put some vice grips on there and it slowed. Once the oil cooler's off, these are the 4 gaskets that fail. Because again, 2 of these, and the orientation might be wrong, 2 of these are going to be coolant, 2 of these are going to be oil. It's basically a water-cooled oil cooler. This is the part number you're going to order from GM. You're going to need 4 of these. And just simply use a pick, pop out the old ones, pop in the new ones, clean up your mating surface, clean up the rest of the cooler if you want. And then we're going to go to the sandwich part and change that gasket, which looks like this. This is basically the same gasket you would use even if there was a block off plate. And that's the GM part number. I had to guess, just based on pulling these out and seeing what's in there, these 2 look like they're the oil passage, and these 2 look like they're the coolant passage. I know that step probably looked useless, but it's normally good to clean anything you're working on, because you can kind of check it out, make sure there's no cracks on it, make sure everything's clean, you're not getting dirt in all the ports that don't need dirt in them. The other important thing is when you go reinstall this, if something happens and it starts leaking again and you put it back in all dirty and grimy, you're not going to be able to tell something's going on. So it always makes sense to clean it before you reinstall it. So again, same deal, we're gonna clean all this up, make sure there's no oil and dirt that's gonna get into these ports and screw up the entire engine. Take out those 2 little bolts up there, replace the gasket, bolt it back down, and then do everything in reverse. So we're ready to put the oil cooler back on. These 2 M6 bolts that hold the gasket to the oil pan, it's going to be 10 Newton meters, which is 89 inch-pounds. And then for the larger M8 bolts that go around, all 8 of those, it's going to be 25 Newton meters, which is 16 foot-pounds. Of course, 10 Newton meters calls for a very specific tool. The mighty Newton meter torque wrench. Since your oil cooler's all cleaned up, has its new gaskets, you put the new gasket at the oil pan and torqued it down to 10 Newton meters, and you cleaned your surface. Go ahead and reinstall it. And now we have an installed oil cooler. And again, like I said before, just clean as you go. It makes everything easier to work on in the future. Actually missed a spot up there I gotta hit. But now you got a baseline, so this oil cooler is nice and clean. If I start seeing any greenish red fluid coming out of here, I know coolant's leaking. If I see any oil coming out, I know oil's leaking. You leave everything looking like that up there, you're never gonna know if you have a leak, new or old. So always makes sense to clean as you go. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna clean that up real quick, and then we are gonna release all our clamps on their coolant lines and see if we have a leak. If nothing leaks, we're good to go. I'm gonna put the oil filter on, bring the car down, and we're gonna add some oil. Little pro tip for when you do oil changes: I typically buy a brand new OEM oil drain plug about every 2 oil changes. The reason why is, if you look at this gasket, over time from cinching it down, it just flattens out. It doesn't seal well anymore. You can see the rib on a brand new one. They sell just this rubber part and you can change them out, but depending on if you're doing your own oil changes or if you have a dealer do it or somebody else do it, they always cinch these things down way too damn tight. And the problem is, even though the gasket is really what's making the seal on the pan, sometimes the bolt gets stretched out, the face gets deflected a little bit, and you spend the money, you put one of these new gaskets on, and it leaks anyways. So for almost $1 more, you get brand new hardware, brand new gasket, and no leaks. Alright, moment of truth. I'm going to start dropping the clamps. And let's see if we leak anywhere. Alright, clamps are off. And so far, so good. Don't see anything weeping out. So what I'm going to do now, since I'm under here, prime my filter, install a new Mobile 1 filter. We're going to get the car down and put some oil in it, and then top off the coolant and bleed it. Oil change is pretty straightforward. Mobile 1, 530, 8 quarts, done. We took a break for lunch, let it sit for about an hour. Everything's dry, so no coolant leaks, no oil leaks. So what we're gonna do is put it on the ground and add more coolant and burp the system. Process that we did in an older video when we replaced the coolant sensor. We're going to open the radiator, we're going to install the Lissel funnel, we're going to add some more coolant, and then we're going to let the car get to operating temperature so that the thermostat opens, coolant starts circulating around, and we're going to see bubbles coming out of the system, and we're going to purge all that air out, close the system again. I don't like messing with dilution mixes, so I'm just using Dexcool 50/50. It's already mixed for you. You don't have to mess with anything. I'll typically keep filling it until I get to this first line before even starting the engine, and then allow expansion to either take in more coolant or expand out some. You don't want to go to the top of this, because if you get any expansion or air bubbling up in the system, it's all going to overfill. It's pretty much leveled out now. I'm going to start the car, get the water pump going, hopefully force all the air out, and it's either going to take more or stay about where it's at. We'll see what happens. You also want to make sure that you turn your heat on so that it's going to circulate through that heater core, and if there's any air in the heater core, it's going to get that out as well. If you keep your AC on, it's never going to run through there, and you might have air trapped in there later on. Again, same process. You're just looking for air that keeps coming up. You want it to purge all that out, and then watch your temps either through a handheld or the gauge, which isn't particularly accurate. You're going to want to get the operating temperature so that that thermostat opens, because without the thermostat open, you're not getting a full loop circulation, so you may still have air in the block or other back locations like the heater core or down lower that hasn't purged itself out. So this process takes maybe 10 minutes, but you just do not want any air coming out of there. Thermostat's still not open, getting some bubbles still. We're sitting at about 160 degrees, so I believe these cars are 180 degree thermostats, so we got about 20 more degrees before that opens. So fans just kicked on. This hose is 180 on and off, so I believe the thermostat is open. Coolant's circulating around. It actually took quite a bit in, so just gonna keep massaging the lines, trying to get as much air out as we can, and then seal the system back up. Alright, next is drive belt. Now, belt has maybe 60,000 miles on it. It's not particularly old, but it's probably the original belt, and it sat in water for a while. So when you get on it, it makes this noise. So we're going to replace that. So we're going to fix that with a new Gates gator back belt. I happen to get some old stock Goodyear gator back belt. But these are the best belts you can get for GM vehicles. They have the teeth on them so they don't slip. So that'll fix our chirping problem. To install a belt on an LS, it's super simple. Obviously you need a new belt. Breaker bar with a 15mm on it. Just go over to the car, and as long as you got an electronic fan, you don't have to worry about like anything being in the way. Just put the breaker bar on the pulley, push right, it takes the tension off the belt, and then you should be able to pull off the belt and put on the new one. Just remember the routing before you take it off. Just like that, new belt installed. Alright, so something I hadn't noticed, and you probably wouldn't when you're messing around with stuff. Pretty well went through all the electronics on the car, but without driving it consistently, I didn't notice that the driver's side mirror is not adjusting. So we got a couple culprits. It could be the actual mirror, it could be the harness from the mirror into the door, or it could be the switch on the driver's side. So we're going to do some diagnostics and try to figure out what's going on. So after doing some troubleshooting, one of the things that you deal with not only used cars but Copart cars is you don't know the history of the car, and you don't know what was already broken before it was totaled out. So obviously took both door panels off, metered everything, and driver's side mirror still adjusted perfectly fine. Could never get the passenger to work. playing around, finally realized that as I'm metering stuff and flipping the little toggle back and forth, set it to the left, driver's side adjusts. Set it to the right, driver's side adjusts. What the hell? Take the switch apart, check all the contacts. Contacts are perfectly clean, perfectly clean, perfectly clean. Then I realize inside the switch, when you toggle from left to right, a little piece actuates here, but another piece actuates here, which is right here. So the problem was, you would actuate the switch to go driver and adjust it, and go to passenger and try to adjust it, but with that piece missing, it never adjusted to the passenger side. So we'll just replace this with either a used part or a new part. So I ordered a new switch, and what I'm noticing is, if you can see on this picture, the design is different. GM must have done a revision because the top part's flat, whereas this kind of has like a rounded top to it. And every place I'm finding has this new revision part, so this may have been a problem with that part breaking off, and they redesigned it, and now that's the only one you can get. So this will be here next week, and we'll move on. Alright, I know what you're saying. How's that mechanical? Well, it's not mechanical in the sense that it's a structural part or anything, but it does close all this up to prevent lift under speed, and GM found it necessary enough to design it and put it on the ZL1, so we're gonna move that over, since obviously it'll work with our ZL1 front fascia. So since this is a 2010, the holes in the subframe are not there, so what we're gonna have to do is put it up, secure it where we can up here, and then drill and either tap or put nutserts in. Front 3 bolts are on, the back's just being held on with a zip tie right now so I can start indexing everything. And what I'm thinking, looking at this now, instead of wasting a bunch of threaded inserts, use these factory push locks, so they're easy enough to pull this out if you got to do an oil change. Probably just hit all the holes down the frame rail, drill them out, put these guys in, push lock it, and that way it's easy enough to remove when it's needed. A couple minutes later, everything is affixed. We used all these OEM pop-ins, so the whole thing is affixed to all the stock locations, even though a 2010 will not have those holes. So what I did too is, after drilling all these and fixing everything, took everything down and painted all the holes into the frame so that they're not going to rust out. Next up is the BMR 1¼ inch drop springs. Now there's a million videos on YouTube on installing these, so I'm just going to do a time lapse and slap on the rears and fronts and just kind of give you an idea of what's going on. here's how the Camaro stands with BMR 1.25" drop springs. Obviously it still needs time to settle a little more. The front should probably come down a little more than it's sitting. Rear's looking just about perfect. So we're gonna let this settle, and in the next video we're gonna finally detail this thing. We're gonna PDR it and try to get it looking good. See you in the next video.